I wish I had Guy's ability with these really sharp phrases. Multiply or die, or was it die to multiply? Either way, don't compete if you want to complete. But what I really love about them is the depth under that. And he's given you a glimpse of the depth under those things, but there's so much more. And so it's a real privilege to be following Guy. You know, I've not had many harder assignments than that. Get to follow Guy, you know. But it is interesting. As we drove in this morning, we were talking about how the Lord was giving us, both last night and today, what we feel like were complementary things to bring. And you might just think the Lord's involved in this somehow. And so it's very exciting to be a part of that. I want to read a paragraph from the book Kingdom Unleashed by Jerry Trousdale and Glenn Sunshine. I recommend it. Strong kingdom theology, strong movement application. But there's a paragraph in there that says when the Global North Church leaders visit kingdom movements in the Global South, the single most powerful response to what they see is, quote, everybody here is making disciples. The accountants, the custodians, the police, the doctors, the farmers, they all see themselves as disciple makers and church planters. And that is so true. As we have listened to wonderful things, and we've had our various conversations, I think there are a few essential things that would strengthen everybody in the room. Some of these you're already applying and understand. Some need to learn some of these things. Some of you need to go deeper in some of these things. And so what I want to do is give a glimpse of 2 or 3 of the core things. I'm going to put up a slide later that has a lot of the key wineskins that all of us need to change in the long run. We're not going to have time to go in depth on any of that. I also want to give you a glimpse of what's going on globally. Data can be boring if you don't realize it represents real people. And so I'm going to give you some glimpses that will include numbers, but it's just very, very significant. I'm about to do a brief clip that you heard us talking about what many of us call the listening movement. I can give you the why we call it that later if you want. And this is the movement we talked about as of December last year, since 2013, over 2 million baptized disciples, and indications already, even before they've really begun to collect the data, that may more than double this year. So what I'm about to show you is not a really cool graphic that we just this theory ought to happen. It actually kind of represents what's happening in movements around the world, including this one that one of our couples is deeply involved in.
Movement strategies are a critical part of seeing the work accomplished. If we don't embrace some version of multiplication, disciples making disciples rapidly, we're not even keeping up with the population growth. The gap is getting bigger in terms of those people groups that are multiplying so quickly.
Multiplication is always faster than addition.
Let's say you were good at making believers. Let's say you could bring 5 people into the kingdom as believers in a week. That's 5 times 52, 260 believers you've made in 1 year. That is very, very fruitful evangelism, right? I don't know many people who bring that number of people into the kingdom, individuals, but you've still only got 1 person at the end of that 1 year who knows how to evangelize and reach more people. So the best you're getting is 250 something every year. But if I know how to make a disciple who can then replicate what I just did, and I only make 1 in a month, by the end of a year, we get to 4,000 something disciples made, who all of them would know, theoretically, how to make other disciples. So a month later, 13 months into the work, you got 8,000 something disciples. It multiplies.
That represents reality of what's happening in many movements. Did you see relationship in there? If I make one disciple a month, that has to be relationship. Doesn't mean the month you're done. Do you see starting small and they make disciples? And then that's when it goes exponential. Not because we've gathered, like Guy said, thousands, but because we focused on 1 and 2 and 3, and they focus on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then they each focus on 2 or 3 or 5. That's when exponential growth happens. So, just to set the stage again, and the good news of the King's reign will be announced, shared in the whole world as a sacrificial witness to all people groups, all ethne, and then the end will come. And Lord, would you let us be a part of that last generation? It will require every sacrifice you and I need to make, and many others around the world. And the Lord may say, no, this is not the last generation, but I'm going to ask it. I invite you to ask it and to do everything as if the Lord's saying yes, because there will come a last generation. All right? Let me put this up as a backdrop. When we began to talk and movements began to emerge in the 90s, movements began to emerge, nobody believed them, and then we began to believe them in the 2000s, and the growth curve of movements is like this. In the 90s, there were 4 movements by this definition. 4 generations of reproducing churches in multiple streams, because what happens is critical mass begins to be achieved, proof of disciple multiplication happens, the momentum will continue, and they go beyond dependence on those who brought the gospel to them, the patriarch of that movement, if you will. If they're still stuck on depending on their great-grandfather or their great-grandmother, they're not going to grow. But when we move past that, when it's like, oh, I'm supposed to go make net fishers of people, and I can do that. One of the greatest things I treasured one time, we were doing a Discovery Bible study. Devin, you were talking about this. And after a couple of times, someone said, well, Kent, we can do this. Yeah, exactly. They were afraid they were insulting me. No, absolutely. Like many of us, I was trained to do all the teaching, like I'm doing today. But we learned to let the group discover. So let me give you a glimpse. Global traditional Christianity. Now, I'm not trying to be mean, I'm just reporting some facts, okay? Global traditional Christianity is growing at about 1.5, 1.8%. Global population is growing about 1.5, 1.8%. You remember last night when I talked about 2,000 known movements by this definition? Those movements are growing at 23%. Do the math. I'm not a math guy, but that's easy math. The only way we're going to get ahead of population growth and get to all of these unreached peoples we keep talking about in all these unreached segments of Atlanta and Houston is by multiplication of disciples who make disciples who make disciples who start churches and change their societies. And alcoholism goes down in a whole region. And wife beating goes down in a whole region. And on. And you also know those examples. One of the things Justin Long shared last year, or at least he shares regularly, I think he shared it here last year, when you do movements and movements in the modern era, you saw this really great slide from Guy. I'm going to steal that slide, by the way, Guy, of all the leaders. Where are you, Guy? I can't see you in the light. There. That's exactly right. I believe that. The Indonesian definition of copyright is the right to copy. So I adapted to culture. So, but as we look at these amazing things that, you know, we can show 6 or 7 movements in the New Testament. He gave you a glimpse of some of them. Somebody's actually broken that out, and incredible stuff. In the modern era, since 2,000 years ago, the highest proportion of movements is now. And 2,000 of them by this definition and these are basement numbers, 115 million disciples. 1% plus of the world's population are disciples making disciples in disciple-making movements or church planting movements, whatever people use different terms. This is incredible. There are 3,500 other efforts that we know about, notice underlining that we know about, that have begun to bear fruit of first-generation churches and some second and some third, but they're not yet to movement level. But that's good. 2,000 that are at movement level, and some of them are way beyond it, and 3,500 of the other, but we need about 30,000 more efforts if you get down to every district by every 100,000. But if you start in the 1990s when the first, if we will, modern movements like this, disciple-making movements that really reached 4 generations by 4 streams plus, and you grow from there, there have been a 10 times increase 4 times. 10 times from what happened in the 90s, and I actually have a slide, but we're just not going to get to it. 4 times doubling. 4 times a 10 times multiplication. These movements are doubling about every 3.5 years. Justin will tell you, if we keep doing this, if we pay whatever price, if we sacrifice it all, and we see 2 to 3 more 10 times growth, we will see the gospel into every people group in the world by 2050. He threatened me when I said I want to share that with this group. I promised him I will jump up and down with caveats. No, I'm not going to jump up and down. But I'm going to tell you, don't just do this number play. These are real numbers. This is a real possibility, but it will cost us everything. There are some of the things that we love to do right now that are good things that we're going to have to give up. Are you willing to give up the dearest things? I enjoy being the guy up front teaching. I had to give a lot of that up. There's still a time for it. What I'm about to present, what Guy's presented, is really weeks of training that we're boiling down into some of the key points just to get the thirst. And some of you are doing this same kind of training. There are movements, by this definition, in every region in the world. What I mean by region, the UN has divided the world into 32 regions: North Africa, Central Africa, Horn of Africa, South Africa, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, you got it. Several parts of the Americas broken into regions. 32 regions. Every region, except maybe Oceania, which is very small, has movements by this definition. And I actually have a chart. Justin has a chart where here's the stage 1, beginning churches. Here's the stage 2 to 4, second, third generation churches. And here are the movements, 4 or 5 generations, 30 generations plus. Every region of the world. But a lot more left to do. The Bhojpuri movement was one of the movements that began to emerge in the 90s. Bhojpuri is actually more a language group than an ethnic group. 90 million, small number, about 9 times the size of Georgia. It's even bigger in Texas. And it's been called for history, yeah, I know. It's been called in history one of the graveyards of mission. And the Lord used several key people, and now, and I was just there was a leadership meeting of the 2414 Global Facilitation Team, and one of the leaders on that is Victor John, Indian guy, amazing, so humble. If you were sitting in a room with him, you wouldn't know that unless one of us told you. Victor is one of the guys the Lord has used to launch a movement in the Bhojpuri language of over 30 million baptized disciples since 1992, 3, somewhere in there. And they've helped launch, or are beginning to help launch, in movements in 11 more languages, and working on scriptures and movement efforts in 7 more languages. It's just astounding. One of the guys in the room, some of you may know of the recent book, Cabbages in the Desert. His name's Isla. He's from East Africa. Grew up in a very staunch Muslim home, amazing story of how he came to faith. And he was telling us just this last Saturday, Sunday, their movements, it's really a group of movements, focused on 320 people groups. They have fruit in they've seen God raise up fruit of disciples, making disciples, in 170 of them. And of those 170, 67 movements by this definition. God's doing astounding things. Let me go back to the Bhojpuri movement. They're making disciples, they're starting churches, they're raising up generations of leaders who are raising up leaders who are raising up leaders. One illustration of what they do. There are, I forget, a huge number of thrown away kids they call railway kids in India. I mean, I've heard 500,000, I've heard 1 million, I don't know. Instead of launching some big global nonprofit to raise tons of money to do this, the Bhojpuri believers who had learned, if Jesus tells you to do it, said, we need to do something. Lord, what do we do? And they began an effort to bring them into their own homes. And as home after home after home would bring them in, and then sometimes they'd collaborate as several homes to rent a little home near them and bring them in there. They said when they would bring these kids in, for the first 2 to 3 days, they would do nothing but sleep. They live in constant terror of robbery, rape, yes, girls and the boys, being totally beaten up all the time. They lived in this desperate situation, and the Lord told these followers of Jesus, bring them into your homes or work together to rent a little home in your neighborhood and feed them, clothe them, and disciple them to know Jesus. Just one of the many, many stories. I want to boil down to talk about 2 key things that are absolutely essential. Some of you know them well. Some of these items you may need to dig in more deeply. If you want to look at John 6 with me. Okay. Having trouble finding my starting. There it is. Verse 43. It's always interesting to start at this verse. Stop grumbling among yourselves, Jesus answered. If the Lord applies that to your life, okay. Stop grumbling amongst yourselves. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day. It is written in the prophets, they will all be taught by God. Everyone who listens to the Father and learns from him comes to me. No one has seen the Father except the one who is from God. This is one of those whys. We were talking with Susie and Matt yesterday, and she says in groups, she's often the one that goes, but why are we doing this? We know we need to do these things, but why? Why do we need to do Discovery Bible studies? Why? Because they will not be taught by you or me. If anything comes out of these sessions this morning, it's because God has spoken to you. It's not because Guy said something. It's not because any of the testimonies. It's because God will teach you. And he's actually quoting Isaiah and alluding to Jeremiah in this passage. They'll all, promises from centuries, they'll all be taught by God. And from the very beginning, before their disciples, here's the biblical passage, here's the biblical story, what is God teaching you? And they learn from the beginning, even before they realize what they're learning, God is the one who's going to teach them. He's the one that's going to show them. And it's amazing, God's the great teacher. Go figure. So I'll tell you a couple of stories to prove the point. And the point of, I love what Devin said, is that Tristan, the guy who said, hey, went and started. Yeah, because here's the scripture, here's some simple questions, and let's listen to what God says to us. Here's a story. We find the person of peace. By the way, person of peace is not the one who just, I want to follow Jesus. Person of peace is the one who is spiritually responsive and opens their group to hear the message. They may do it right away, they may do it shortly after, but person of peace is not the person who goes, I want to follow Jesus, as wonderful as that is. The Mark 1 passage that we just dealt with, I think, just read a little further in the passage, I think is the story of one of the first houses of peace, if not the first that Jesus found. I think Simon, Andrew, James, and John, and their household, their social unit, their social network, are one of the first, if not the first. So Jesus did it. He found people of peace. He discipled them. He was in their household. And then what happens? The whole village comes to be healed. And then when Jesus said at the end, go make disciples, they didn't go, wait a minute, what does that mean? No, he had done it with them. All he did is blow the magnitude open of all ethnic groups. You Jewish guys, go to the people that hate you, go to the people that like you, and make disciples. They knew how to make disciples. So this person found a person of peace, said, this is a very important spiritual conversation. Are there others in your group, your family, that we would like to hear? I'll come and we'll share another story from God. This was a Hindu setting. She gathered her friends, her family, and like all of us, she had that skeptical neighbor friend, right? Woman sat on the edge of the couch going, yeah, whatever. And they told the story in 10 minutes. They didn't pull out a Bible. They didn't pull out a phone. They just told the story of how God created the world. 10-minute version of it. And then they asked the simple questions. What does it teach us about God? What does it teach us about us and people? What does it teach us we ought to do? And this skeptical woman said, if this story's true, and there's a God who created everything, we ought not worship anything that's created, should we? Now, can you imagine you and me going into a Hindu setting going, y'all quit worshiping those gods, that's a bad thing. Yeah, I don't care what culture you are, I don't care how nice you are. Every wall in the world goes up. But she said, we ought not worship those gods, anything that's created, should we? Amazing, God can speak to her. Didn't need the outsider to do it. Same situation, person of peace, gathered their family, this time in Muslim Indonesia. And story of creation. What does this story teach us? And this lady said, it's a small village setting. Well, this story tells us that God saw everything he made and said it was good. And that means the goats that I herd every day are good. And that means I would not beat those goats, should I? Would you have thought to make that application? Well, part of this, and you heard about it, is accountability. So the next week, before you go to the next story, go around, and so if they said, Mrs. So-and-so, how'd you do about the goats? You said the Lord told you probably not a good idea to beat the goats. She said, well, I still beat them, but I only beat them half as much. I think the Lord took that as their first step of obedience, and I think the goats appreciated it. God is the teacher. And if we're still teaching instead of helping them teach, and if we're teaching their children, our grandchildren spiritually, and not helping them teach them, then we're doing it wrong. We should not be the ones that keep doing, and teaching is helping people learn, not doing all the talking. And Guy modeled what most of us do in many of these situations a while ago with this discovery process. Second key thing I want us to highlight. Luke 10 is a passage that many of us go to, and I just want to highlight a few things from it. From Luke 1 to 8, or several chapters into Luke through verse 8, we see Jesus doing his thing. Follow me, let me show you what this looks like. He's healing the sick, he's helping the poor, he's telling the good news of the kingdom, He's casting out demons and so forth. And then Luke 9, we see him send the 12 out that have been following him and said, now you guys go and do the same thing. And they came back and debriefed. Luke 10, he sends out the 72 others. We don't even have their names. I don't know if when we get to heaven, can I meet some of those 72? I don't know. I don't know if that works that way, but that'd be cool. Tell me your experience. I'd love to hear the story. But he sent the 72 others out. Was it disciples the 12 had made? Don't know. Doesn't matter. And they went out and they did the same thing. Go out, look for the person of peace. I would rephrase it, speak well-being to someone if they speak well-being back. Speak wholeness to someone if they speak wholeness back. You want to speak, I call it a spiritually fragrant word or deed that invites but does not force response. And those that go, oh, that smells good, we talk more with. And then what does it say? When that person speaks wellness and whole being back to you, stay there and don't go door to door. Stay in that household, and we know that's because, why? Why do we stay there instead of keep going? Why do we stay in that household? That's who you invest in, because what are they going to do? They're the ones that are going to share. They're the ones that are going to be the key to their neighbors. And so we invest in them to help them raise up new children of God, new children of God, new households. So it makes sense. Some really cool things with that. But then Jesus, they celebrate, and Jesus said, that's great, but really what you need to celebrate is your names in the book of life. And then he says something very unusual. And I saw a trained theologian, he legitimately was, that was his vocation, from Russia. When he saw this verse in this context, he slapped his hands on the table and said, that's changed my whole theology forever. The verse is, that later in verse 21, Luke 10, at that time, Jesus, full of joy through the Holy Spirit, said, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you've hidden these things from the wise and learned and revealed them to little children. The word is one of those Greek complex words that meant he overflowed with joy. It wasn't, he was joyful. He just busted out with joy. And he said, look, these everyday people can do what I did and what I do. That's why he's so happy. Look at these everyday people, the janitors, the attorneys, the fisher people. Look, they can do it. It's proven. Later in some of Paul's writings, it's like the church proves to the heavenlies, God's plan works. So what are some examples, a couple of examples about the fragrant words and deeds that invite spiritual response but don't force it? And that's what opens the door to people coming to faith. 2 stories. Go back to Central Asia, Western Asia, any of the most radical areas you can think of, and the only reason I don't tell you is because the people who tell us say we're not even going to tell you where it is, and we honor their choice. It's their story. But there's a group that the Lord said from this region, from some pretty radical religious backgrounds, and they're following Jesus, and the Lord said, I want you to go into this new territory, and it's dangerous, and it's in the height of COVID. And so a group of the guys went. They went up into the mountains, a very difficult journey, and they get close to a pretty good-sized town up there, and as they get close to town, they see dead bodies out in the field, here and then there, unburied, and there, all the way into town. Now remember, this is the height of COVID. And so they went in, and they found out that when people died, people were so afraid of the COVID infection, they would not bury their own family members. They were fearful, with good reason. So these guys, the Lord said, you go back and you bury these bodies. So the guys went out. They hadn't been received really well. Everybody's suspicious of outsiders, even though they were from a similar ethnicity. And they went back and they began to bury the body after body after body after body. And then 2 or 3 came out to them kind of furtively and said, "We thank you. You've taken away our shame. We were afraid to bury our own dead. You have honored us. You have restored honor to our family." And out of that, they said, "Well, it's because we follow Jesus and he told us to do this." And out of that came spiritual conversations. And out of that, many of these households came to faith and became church as they were discipled. That's a Shema. So many of us use the shorthand Shema, the Deuteronomy 6, 3, and 4 and following, hear and obey. It's this lovely hear and obey. It's not this legalistic hear and obey. It's hear and do it my way. And it's this Shema action, this fragrant word or deed that draws people's attention into spiritual conversation, and it opens them up. And we walk in the relational conversation that brings them to faith. And they begin to love and serve Jesus. And then they say, "Well, we can do this." Absolutely. You listen to God. We'll coach you. We're your spiritual parents. Absolutely. We'll walk along with you, but you do it. And like Jesus, we'll overflow with joy and say, "Look, they're doing what Jesus did. They're doing what we learned to do." Some of these movements begin to send out what we call hot coals. They're already making disciples in their own setting. And they say, we're going to go somewhere else. But many of them will send a whole family or a clan. They found that they sent 2 guys into other territory, even though the similar ethnicity, people are suspicious. If they send a family, they're like, "Well, who kicked you out of your community? Why'd you come to our community?" So they learned in several of these settings to send clans, grandparents, several adult children and their spouses and their kids. And they would go and do whatever they were already doing, earning a living. In this story, they went to another region. They were wool weavers. They would weave rugs and stuff. And of course, part of wool weaving is you got to have the sheep, and then you got to harvest the wool and so forth. So they moved into a whole territory, again, several generations of that clan, probably 15, 20 people. And so they're trying to figure out, "Lord, what's the open door here? Where do we build a relationship?" And about the time they moved in, they found out that the whole community gathered all their sheep into one big mass, and collectively as a community, they would shear the sheep. And there was this huge field of sheep. And this is how they would do it. And by the way, it was just the women who sheared the sheep. The guys sat around and drank coffee and smoked cigarettes and, sorry, broken culture. That's what happened. The women were the ones out shearing the sheep. And this is what they do. 4 women would grab a leg each. One would pin the head because the sheep was fighting like crazy. And then someone would shear the sheep. And next one, 5 people on it, shear the sheep, fighting like crazy. 5 people on it, fighting like crazy. So this grandmother and these adult daughters or daughter-in-laws watched. Toward the end of the day, it was their turn. And they had some sheep. And the grandmother, they brought the sheep to the grandmother. She lifted it up on her lap, just put it across the lap like a little baby, and said, "Little sheep, don't be afraid. God loves you." And the sheep just kind of went limp, and they sheared the sheep. Nobody holding it. Next sheep, "Little sheep, God loves you." The next morning, they woke up, this clan that had moved as hot coals from one movement into a barren area. The whole community had come and were waiting for them to come out for the next day of sheep shearing. And they said this, "Would you come and do this for all of our sheep? Because when we try to shear our sheep, it's as if they are possessed by Satan. But when you shear your sheep, we feel God's peace." And they started a reproducing group of disciple churches there. That's Shema. That's fragrant word or deed that invites, but does not force response. It's not a sales approach. It's a genuine spiritual speaking wholeness, speaking well-being. And those that God has spiritually prepared. I used to think I had to go make people hungry for the gospel. Let me force salt in your mouth and prove to you why you've got to figure this out. Instead of, God's the one who stirred them up. My job is to bear witness until someone goes, hey. And then I'm like, okay, you're the one God's prepared. You have some family you want to gather and we'll talk. When we boil things down to some of these simple approaches and then say, you do the same thing and I'll coach you. Instead of, I have a cousin down here, Kent, would you go win them? And I'm like, no, you go do it. I'll coach you. We'll meet. You'll tell me how it went and we'll say, well, maybe you could do this better. I'll still coach you. I'll still be in a relationship, but you go do it. And all of a sudden they're going, well, I can make disciples. I can start churches. Yeah. And Jesus overflowed with joy and said, look, they can do it too. Just like I did. Just like I do. Lord, let there be movements across the state of Georgia. Let there be movements that spring from here into all the other connections we have around the world with many, many countries. And we thank you in the name of Jesus.